Sublevel 0 is a 6 degrees of freedom FPS boasting roguelike elements. The game is an obvious homage to the Descent series. It even goes so far as to retain a very low-fidelity art style reminiscent of those pixelated classics. But Sublevel 0 also attempts to modernize the 6 degrees of freedom genre quite a bit compared to the classics, and unfortunately, it doesn't always succeed. The first thing you'll notice about Sublevel 0 are the visuals. Unless this is the first you're seeing of the game, I probably don't even need to tell you how good it looks. The game combines low-poly environments, pixel art textures, and as many lighting effects as they could stuff into one game to keep the look and feel of Descent, whilst also bringing it up to the level of visual appeal you'd expect from a 2015 release. But you're not buying an FPS for the visuals. Well, shit, I hope you're not anyway. So how does it play? Pretty damn good, actually. It's hard to put into objective terms how it feels to play an FPS, but put simply, it's about as satisfying to move and shoot as you could expect it to be. There's an immense amount of satisfaction you can get from really understanding how to use these movement mechanics as well. I found the combat most enjoyable when rushing into a room full of enemies, dodging from place to place, narrowly avoiding enemy bullets, and hopefully hitting a few of my own. You really need to know what you're doing to pull it off, and it feels great when you do. The game just feels great to play, especially when you're going guns blazing. Unfortunately, Sublevel 0 doesn't always incentivize this style of play. Most of the time it's far more effective to simply stay back, away from enemies, using line of sight and abusing enemy weapon ranges. Otherwise it's way too easy to use more health kits than you're getting and find yourself in a bad position. They attempt to encourage you to rush in by having enemies drop EXP, which will disappear after maybe 15 seconds. This ties into one of Sublevel 0's several RPG and quote-unquote roguelike mechanics, and this is kind of where the game starts to fall apart. I mentioned that Sublevel 0 attempts to modernize what Descent was doing all those years ago. That's all well and good, but you really have to think about how you're modernizing your game. Here you have a lot of tacked-on modern trends that just seem to be here because that's what people are doing nowadays, without any real regard to whether or not it actually works or makes sense for the kind of game this is. If you're looking at this game because you're trying to find a decent roguelike FPS hybrid, then I'm sorry to say, but most of these roguelite mechanics are either pointless or arguably even detrimental to the game as a whole. I said you're incentivized to play more aggressively by timed EXP drops. This might have worked better if any of the perks this EXP was used for were actually remotely interesting, but on top of being incredibly boring, most aren't even that useful. These are actually some of the most creatively starved upgrades I've ever seen. Most are just slight stat changes, and they're all trade-offs. They'll increase your damage for one weapon type, but decrease it for all of the others. Increase your fire rate, but reduce your accuracy. They likely aren't going to change up your gameplay in varied and interesting ways, as upgrades in the roguelite genre usually try to do. Simply put, these upgrades are not compelling. Someone also saw fit to put in randomized loot drops and a crafting system. The biggest difference I've seen from one item of the same type to the next is a 1 or 2 damage increase or decrease. There are no interesting properties that change how a weapon functions, just minor stat changes. The crafting system seems about as necessary as it does in every other modern shooter, that is to say, not at all. It's only really used to access crafting-only weapons, but these weapons don't appear to be much more powerful than the basic guns. It seems like this feature was only tacked on so that you had something to do with the inventory cluttering loot system, which is itself just another tacked-on feature. Crafting systems don't need to be this superfluous, especially not in an RNG-focused game. Craftable items could have been used as a baseline for balance and an assurance that the player will always be able to bring themselves near a certain strength level. This can allow the developers to create higher variance RNG and potentially make loot more interesting without totally shafting the players if they're unlucky. The idea being, if you get absolutely terrible gear drops, you can at least craft something decent that might keep you alive until you find something better. Sublevel 0 doesn't do anything interesting or intelligent with its crafting. They just put in a crafting system because games in 2015 have crafting. And the roguelike mechanics aren't really any different. You can call me cynical, but it seems like random level generation here is just an excuse to not have to make real levels, and permadeath to pad the game length. Even with random level generation, there isn't a lot of content here. You'll probably have seen everything there is to see within an hour or two. It seems like a lot of developers recently are putting roguelike elements into their games without really understanding what makes them fun or interesting, and without thinking about if they even actually mesh well with the game they're making. You'll notice that most of my complaints about the game are complaints about the roguelite mechanics, but not the FPS mechanics. It's easy to see how great this game could have been if they hadn't decided to bog it down with mechanics it doesn't need. The gameplay here is fun and challenging, and the enemies are decently varied, something lacking in many recent shooters. I think they could have really done some interesting stuff if they bothered to build levels by hand. Instead, we have procedural generation replacing good level design. So despite amazing visuals and good gameplay, it's incredibly hard for me to recommend this game. Anyone looking for an FPS is better off playing a more pure experience. Anyone looking for a roguelite is better off playing something with greater variety and more interesting mechanics. Hell, even if you're looking for a hybrid of the two, there are still some better options out there for you. Sublevel 0 seems like a good game being held back by mechanics it shouldn't really have. Like so many other games recently, it tries to hop on the roguelite bandwagon, and in doing so, it thoughtlessly throws in modern design trends that either aren't well executed or just don't fit the kind of game they are making, weighing down what could have otherwise been a very solid FPS. If you find it on a good sale or just really love this style of game, feel free to pick it up. Otherwise, I wouldn't bother.